My family sat me down to talk about my poverty. They didn't know the headline was already written. My parents called it a family meeting, but the word they kept circling was concern. "We're worried about you," my mother said, folding her hands like this was a prayer circle, not an ambush. My father nodded beside her, eyes fixed on the table as if the wood grain had answers he didn't want to say out loud. My name is Alexandra Reed, and that evening, I was invited to my childhood home to be informed collectively that I was poor. Not struggling. Not between things. Poor. My younger brother sat back in his chair, arms crossed, already bored. My aunt smiled too tightly, the way people do when they think kindness means silence. Someone had brought pie. No one touched it. Dad cleared his throat. "At your age, stability matters. You're renting. You don't own. You're always cutting back." One smiles. My mother added gently, "We just don't want you pretending everything's fine when it's not." Pretending. I glanced around the table and realized this wasn't concern, it was consensus. They had compared notes. Bank accounts they didn't see. Clothes I didn't upgrade. A car I kept because it worked. In their minds, frugality had become evidence. They offered solutions I hadn't asked for. Moving back home. A real job. A loan with conditions. My brother finally looked up. "You don't have to be embarrassed," he said. "Families help their own." I nodded. I thanked them. I didn't correct a single assumption, because what they didn't know, what I hadn't told anyone, was that my phone, face down beside my plate, had already begun to vibrate. And somewhere beyond that dining room, a headline was preparing to go live. They thought this meeting was about my poverty. They were wrong. I didn't become the family embarrassment overnight. It happened slowly, the way labels usually do, quietly, then all at once. Growing up, I was the practical one. Not the loud achiever, not the golden child. I got good grades, stayed out of trouble, and learned early how to be self-sufficient. My parents praised responsibility, but only when it came wrapped in something visible: titles, promotions, houses with lawns. My younger brother fit that picture easily. He followed a clear path, collected milestones like trophies, and talked about them often. I learned to listen. After college, I took a job that didn't sound impressive at dinner parties. It wasn't flashy, and it didn't come with a recognizable brand name. What it did come with was room to learn, to experiment, to fail privately. When I left that job to start building something of my own, I didn't announce it. I just did the work. To my family, silence looked like stagnation. I didn't upgrade my car when I could have. I kept renting when buying would have been easy. I wore the same coats for years, cooked at home, and turned down vacations. Every spare dollar went back into the company. Servers, legal fees, engineers who believed in the idea before it had a name anyone recognized. I wasn't hiding money, I was hiding progress. But from the outside, it looked like I was falling behind. Comments started slipping in casually. "Are you still doing that little project? You know, it's okay to admit something didn't work. Your cousin just bought a place, have you thought about stability?" I learned not to correct them. Every explanation turned into a debate. Every update became advice I didn't ask for. So I stopped sharing. I let them believe I was scraping by, drifting, unsure. It was easier than managing their expectations while trying to meet my own. Over time, the story solidified without my input. Alexandra Reed, the one who never quite launched. The one who lived below her potential. The one people worried about. They mistook my restraint for failure. My patience for fear. My quiet for lack of ambition. And maybe that was my fault for letting them write a story I refused to interrupt. But what they never understood was this. I wasn't behind. I was just early. The longer my family believed I was struggling, the more comfortable they became telling me how to fix my life. It always started gently. Suggestions offered with sympathetic smiles and lowered voices, like they were protecting me from something fragile inside myself. My mother would ask if I'd considered something more stable. My father sent job listings he thought were perfectly respectable. None of them ever asked what I actually did with my days. Then the advice sharpened. At dinners, my brother would lean back and explain how adulthood worked, as if I'd missed a seminar everyone else attended. "You can't live like a student forever," he said once, gesturing toward my coat. At some point, you need assets. When I didn't respond, he took that as confirmation. They began offering help with strings attached. A loan, but only if I agreed to move closer. A place to stay, but only temporarily until I found something real. My mother suggested she could manage my budget if I sent her my numbers. She framed it as care. I heard it as oversight. What bothered me most wasn't the money. It was the assumption behind it that because they thought I had less, they were entitled to more of me, more access, more say, more authority over decisions that were already made. Every boundary I didn't draw became permission. They talked about me when I wasn't in the room. I could feel it in the way conversations stopped when I walked in, or how explanations were simplified like I wouldn't understand. Once my aunt asked if I was doing okay emotionally. I realized then that poverty, in their minds, had quietly become incompetence. I tried, briefly, to push back. I said I was fine. I said I had plans. But without visible proof, my words sounded defensive even to me. So I stopped arguing. Silence again felt easier. That's how the family meeting happened. They decided concern required coordination. That my situation needed intervention. Advice turned into strategy. Strategy turned into control. By the time they sat me down at that table, they weren't asking how to help. They were telling me what came next. And they were confident I'd agree because in their version of the story, I didn't have the power to say no. There was a version of the truth I could have offered them at any time. I chose not to. While my family debated my lack of direction, my days were mapped down to the hour. Mornings began before sunrise. Not because I was chasing motivation but because investors on the East Coast preferred early calls. By mid-morning, I was deep in product reviews, code, infrastructure, security audits that had to be flawless long before anyone ever noticed us. Afternoons were for people. Engineers who trusted me enough to follow without guarantees, advisors who challenged every assumption, lawyers who asked questions designed to break things before the market could. None of that fit into polite conversation. I didn't tell them about the term sheets that came and went, or the first time a fund wired 7 figures with nothing but a signature and a handshake. I didn't mention the nights I slept on the office couch, or the weeks I paid myself nothing so payroll cleared on time. I didn't explain why my clothes were plain or my apartment modest. Every dollar had an assignment long before I did. The company grew the way strong things often do, quietly, under pressure. We missed deadlines. We rebuilt systems. We scrapped months of work when the data told us to. There were moments I questioned everything, moments when I stared at the ceiling at 3 a.m., wondering if silence had become cowardice. But I kept going, because stopping to explain felt like a distraction I couldn't afford. By the time bankers entered the picture, my calendar became a maze. Due diligence, financial modeling, regulatory prep, meetings where people spoke in careful language and looked at me like I was already something they couldn't quite name yet. When the word IPO was first said out loud, I laughed. It sounded unreal, dangerous, final. Still, I didn't correct my family. Not because I wanted to surprise them but because I wanted certainty before recognition. I didn't want pride that arrived early and vanished if things went wrong. I didn't want advice from people who hadn't carried the weight. So I let them believe the simplest story. That I was behind. That I was drifting. That I needed guidance. What they never understood was that silence wasn't surrender. It was focus. And by the time their concern crystallized into a meeting, the truth had already passed the point where explanations mattered. It happened in the smallest moment. My phone buzzed once, soft, almost polite, against the wooden table. I ignored it. We were still in the middle of my mother's carefully rehearsed speech about options and backup plans. Then my brother's phone vibrated. He frowned, glanced down, and flipped it face up. A second later, my father's phone lit up. Then my aunt's. The room shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence. The air thickened with that charged quiet that comes right before something irreversible. My mother was the last to look. She reached for her phone with a sigh, as if annoyed by the interruption. Her expression didn't change at first. Then it froze. Her eyes moved across the screen once, twice. She leaned closer, like distance might fix what she was seeing. What is this? She asked, more to herself than to anyone else. My brother stood up. Wait, no. That can't be. He turned his phone toward the table. I didn't need to lean in. I already knew the headline. Forbes breaking. Aurora Systems files for IPO founder Alexandra Reed retains majority stake. Underneath it, my photo. A recent one. Neutral background, direct gaze. The kind of image people choose when they're done being misunderstood. No one spoke. My father's chair scraped backward as he stood abruptly, staring at the screen like it might rearrange itself if he looked long enough. My aunt whispered my name, the way people do when reality arrives without warning. This says, my brother swallowed. This says the valuation is, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The number sat there, bold and merciless. High 9 figures, projected to cross 10 shortly after listing. My mother looked at me then. Not with concern. Not with pity. With calculation. Alexandra, she said slowly, why didn't you tell us? I felt something settle in my chest, not triumph, not anger. Relief. Like finally setting down something heavy I'd been carrying without realizing how tight my grip had been. I wasn't hiding, I said. My voice didn't shake. You never asked the right questions. Silence again. Deeper this time. My father tried to laugh. It came out wrong. This must be new. Very recent. I shook my head. The filing went in weeks ago. Today was just the announcement. Phones kept buzzing. Group chats. Alerts. Messages piling up faster than anyone could read them. My brother's expression shifted from disbelief to something sharper, opportunistic. So, you're, set then? He asked. I mean, this changes things. I looked around the table at the faces that had gathered to discuss my poverty. The offers of control. The advice disguised as concern. Yes, I said finally. It changes things. As a vision's tackle, as a vision's time. Just not in the way they thought. Because in that moment, while Forbes finished what I'd started, I realized the meeting they'd called to define me had ended with them learning exactly where they stood. And for the first time, the story in the room wasn't theirs to tell. The shock didn't last long. Panic never does. My mother was the first to recover. She straightened her posture, smoothed her blouse, and slipped into a familiar tone, composed, managerial, rehearsed. Well, she said lightly, this explains a lot. We always knew you were capable. We were just worried you were under too much pressure. Always knew. My father nodded too quickly, as if agreement might rewind the last hour. You should have told us, he said, not unkindly, but with an edge of accusation. We could have supported you. Helped manage things. Manage things. My aunt reached for my hand and missed. This is such a relief, she said. You had us so concerned. The word concerned floated around the table like an excuse, passed from person to person until no one owned it. My brother pulled his chair closer, voice suddenly low and confidential. So, Aurora Systems, he said, testing the name. That's huge. We should talk sometime about opportunities. I've got ideas. Of course he did. Phones continued buzzing nonstop, messages from relatives who hadn't checked on me in years. Old classmates. Distant connections resurfacing with suspicious warmth. My mother glanced at her screen and frowned. This is already spreading, she muttered. We need to be careful how this looks. That was the moment it became clear. They weren't embarrassed by how they'd treated me. They were afraid of how it would appear now. My father started talking about privacy. My mother mentioned discretion. Someone suggested we keep this in the family until things settled. Control rebranded itself as protection. I listened. I nodded when politeness required it. But inside, something had shifted permanently. The concern they'd staged was gone, replaced by something colder and more strategic. They weren't trying to understand me anymore. They were trying to manage the story. And for the first time, I realized how much of my life had been shaped by their version of events and how quickly that version changed when power entered the room. They hadn't found respect. They were scrambling to recover influence. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I didn't correct every lie they told themselves to feel better. I simply set boundaries. When my brother hinted at collaborations, I changed the subject. When my mother suggested we meet privately to talk through next steps, I declined. When my father offered advice on handling media attention, I thanked him and ignored it. Success doesn't erase history, it clarifies it. I wasn't interested in revenge, and I wasn't interested in rewriting the past to make anyone more comfortable. The concern they'd shown only when they thought I was weak didn't qualify as support. And respect that appears after a headline isn't respect, it's reaction. I made it clear, calmly and without apology, that my work, my company, and my decisions were not open for family management. I didn't owe explanations for the years they'd misunderstood or minimized me. What I owed myself was consistency. They could either meet me where I stood now or accept that access, like trust, isn't automatically restored just because the outcome surprised them. Respect, I learned, isn't something people can claim retroactively. It's something they either practiced all along or forfeited quietly. Long after the meeting ended and the headlines moved on, one truth stayed with me. Being poor was never the problem. What unsettled my family wasn't my bank balance or my lifestyle. It was my refusal to perform success on their terms. They needed visible proof, titles, purchases, milestones they could point to before they felt comfortable trusting me. My quiet didn't scare them because it meant failure. It scared them because it meant independence. I learned that day that people often confuse access with entitlement, and concern with control. When they thought I had nothing, they felt justified stepping in. When they realized I had built something substantial, they stepped back, but not out of humility. Out of caution. I don't resent them anymore. Resentment requires permission, and I've stopped giving it. I built my life without applause, and I learned to measure success without witnesses. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's simple. Silence isn't weakness. Frugality isn't failure. And sometimes the most powerful response is letting the truth arrive on its own terms when it no longer needs defending. If this story resonated with you, I want you to know you're not alone, and I'd truly like to hear from you. Leave a comment and tell me what you would have done in my place, or share a moment when someone underestimated you before knowing the full truth. Your voice matters more than you think. What I learned through all of this is something I hope you carry into your own life. You don't owe anyone visibility, proof, or performance just to be respected. Quiet effort is still effort. Boundaries are not punishments, they're protections. And success doesn't need witnesses to be real. If people only believe in you after results appear, that tells you more about them than it ever did about you. If you found strength or clarity in this story, please support the channel by liking, subscribing, and turning on notifications. It helps stories like this reach people who need them. And don't forget to engage. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to read today.